All right. So, today's plan, we are mainly going to be talking about the topic of, let me just put it in green. No, I'll just do it. Complex arguments. So that's what we're going to be talking about. It's basically going to be the last class, and we're talking about arguments. It's going to be combining a lot of the stuff we've talked in the last few classes and how to stick it together. That's going to be the general thing we'll be looking at. That's what your homework will be on. Warning, the homework for this week is definitely the hardest one of the semester. And I don't mean of the semester so far. I mean just overall. It's the most difficult one. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, reach out. Also, if you find it difficult, that's totally normal. It doesn't mean you're dumb. It doesn't mean anything. It just means that it's a harder homework. That's what today is. But before we do that, I want to do a couple of things. First off, I want to one last time review validity, because it's something that some people had trouble with on the homework, and that's normal. Everyone has a little trouble with validity the first time. And then I want to go over the homework one at a time, like just literally go through the answers, make sure everyone's on the same page. I will be handing back the homeworks tomorrow morning. There were a few people who had stuff come up, so they weren't able to turn them in until just before class, and I didn't want to have the correct answers out in the world before people turned it in. So that's why you haven't gotten it back yet. So first off, what is the definition of validity? One of the homework, in each homework question, one of the things you were asked is this valid? And validity is, as I said last time, something that's kind of difficult to understand, because it's not the same as the conclusion being true. It's not the same as the premises being true. It's a specialty notion that is designed to capture the idea of how good an argument is. So what is the definition of validity? Any takers? Any brave souls out there?
If a premise is true, the conclusion's like guaranteed?
Yes, if the premises are true, or even if you were to assume the premises true, if you assume the premises are true, so if the premises are true or assumed to be true, so it's not that the premises actually have to be true in the actual real world. It's rather, if you assumed they were true, could the conclusion be false? If the premises are true or assumed to be true, the conclusion must be true. Another way of saying that is if the conclusion cannot be false if the premises are true, or if the conclusion is false, then it cannot be the case that the premises are true. If the conclusion is false, at least one of the premises must be false. So this can be very tricky, because there are lots of cases of arguments that are not valid because they are hidden amongst other sorts of things. And it can be tempting to say, oh no, that's a valid argument, because we draw on our everyday knowledge. And it's very important to keep apart the conclusion is true from the argument is valid. So here's the first one I want to do as an example of trying to tease them apart one last time. The sky is blue, therefore Joe Biden is president. Is this a valid argument? No, it is not a valid argument. Nicole, Raph are shaking heads. Why not? Why is this not the case?
Well, because the sky could be any other color, and Joe Biden, like, they don't really have any type of correlation.
There's nothing connecting them, but more importantly, here's the key. Let's just stipulate that the premise is true, that the sky is blue, which it is. It is true. Can we imagine a world in which Joe Biden is not president, but the sky is still blue? What would that world have looked like? Well, 4 years ago, or the 4 years leading up to this one. It involved an orange man. There was an orange man, he was the president, but the sky was still blue. So that would be a case, and that's how you check. Very often, a a valid argument will be one in which these go together, where there's a connection. But it's also, strictly speaking, the case any argument is going to be true, or any argument is valid if the conclusion is false. No, if the conclusion is true, give me 1 second to think this through. If the conclusion is true, then an argument is by definition going to be valid. This is something which we have trouble with and like wrapping our head around, because as a practical matter of fact, no one would ever put this argument. If pigs, no, let's just go with pigs can fly, therefore 2 + 2 = 4. That is, technically speaking, a valid argument. Why is this, technically speaking, a valid argument? Well, it's technically speaking a valid argument because the conclusion is by definition always true. It's always true that 2 + 2 = 4. Therefore, it's impossible to have a case in which this is true and this is false. So regardless of whether pigs fly, it's kind of irrelevant. The key of validity is, if the premises are true, is the conclusion, is it possible to have a case in which this is true and this is false? That's all you need to check. You can ignore everything else. That's
then, sorry, when the conclusion's true, that becomes a sound argument, right?
It's, so this would not be sound, actually, because pigs cannot fly. It has to be a true premises and true conclusion to count as sound. But it would count as valid because this happens to be true. So yeah. Again, I will never test you on this because I think it's always a tricky, annoying sort of thing, and that's why you didn't have these stupid sorts of questions of if pigs fly, pigs can fly, therefore 2 + 2 = 4. It's not something that I think is that valuable to know in a critical thinking class, because this is more practical than a pure logic class. Like if you take a formal logic class, that sort of thing, you have to like really wrap your head around. In practice, you're never going to find somebody saying the sky is blue, therefore pigs can fly, or the sky is blue, therefore 2 + 2 = 4. That's not something someone says, but it is a useful way just to say that validity is a technical term that needs to be kept separate from is this a good argument, etc. Now this one here, if dogs had wings, they could fly, but dogs don't have wings. This proves that dogs can't fly. Is this a valid argument? How would we go about answering this? What's step one to see if it's valid? Step one is what? Don't worry about getting the answer yet. What do we do first?
See if the premise is correct.
You say the premises are correct. We just stipulate, we assume they're true. So we're going to assume that it's true that if dogs had wings, they could fly, and not that they're too fat, that even if they had wings, they couldn't fly. We're going to say this is true. And we're also going to say it is true that dogs don't have wings. I've never met a dog that doesn't have wings. That's also true. But so how do we test whether, and maybe there is a dog that has wings, but let's just assume for the sake, dogs, there's no winged dogs. Nobody has ever taken poor Fido and like installed wings into him, which I'm sure has happened somewhere on the dark web, but I don't like to think about it. So the last bit, this proves that dogs can't fly. That would be the conclusion. Is this a valid argument? I'll give you a clue, it's a trick question. And this is another way in which valid comes apart from common sense. Can we imagine a world in which dogs had wings, or dogs didn't have wings, and yet dogs could still fly? That's how you test if it's valid. Can anyone imagine a world in which dogs didn't have wings, but they could fly? What would this world look like? You might have to get creative, but what would it look like?
Like flying.
Say that again, Cassandra, you cut out for a sec. Or type it, if you can.
I said it would look like flying dogs.
Yeah, they would fly in some other way. So imagine here's the dog, and imagine it had like a little jetpack. This would be a world in which dogs were flying even though they didn't have wings. So in that, we can think of a world in which dogs didn't have wings and yet they still flew. So again, not valid. So this is just a way to highlight that when looking for valid, what you really need to focus on is just thinking to yourself, can I imagine a case in which the premises are true and the conclusion is false? You don't, like, it's very tempting to think in the way you would in the real world. It'd be like, well, yeah, dogs don't have wings, therefore they don't fly. Of course not. That would be explaining it. But when we're in a logic-y critical thinking classroom, always think, does this case plus this, can the premises be true and the conclusion be false? Even if it involves thinking of a world very different from the real world, even if it involves some real creativity, that's how you test for validity. All right, so with that in mind, let's quickly go through the homework. Now, good news for everybody. The importance of validity for the semester is basically going to be over after today. I'm going to be much less concerned about it, so we don't have to worry about these crazy cases. But it is something that is a very useful term to know, because it is important to understand the difference between an argument that's structured well and one that happens to get the right conclusion. They're very different things, and a good paper or a good persuading someone requires not just that they agree with your conclusion, but rather that you do it in a good way, such that in the future you can use that same sort of reasoning on the next person or in the next case. All right, so here we go. Any questions on that validity stuff before I share my screen? Are we doing all right? All right. Chat, nope, where's share screen? Share screen and this one. All right, is it being shared? Are we sharing okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. All right,
Yes.
so over the past 118 Mondays, my grandma sang Old Town Road as she ate breakfast. It's Monday, therefore grandma is going to sing Old Town Road at breakfast today. Is this deductive or inductive?
Inductive.
It is inductive, and it's inductive because it relies on using past experience to draw a conclusion about the future. Now, if it's inductive, that means we're not concerned about validity, we're worried about cogency. And I took, depending on what your explanation was, either yes, it's cogent or no, it's not. Generally, I assume that that's a lot of Mondays in a row. So if you just said, yes, it's cogent, I gave you credit for it. If, however, you said, no, it's not cogent, and it's not cogent because it could be a special day that's very different from those other 118 Mondays, then I took it and gave you credit for it. Because cogency is kind of a wishy-washy concept where, actually, let me pull out of the sharing for a second. In an inductive argument with cogency, it comes down to two things. It comes down to one, number of cases, and two, similarity with current case. So for instance, if you're wondering, if you're trying to use past experience to decide what's going to happen in the future or what's going to happen currently, you need to make sure that one, it wasn't just a one-off fluke, or that it was just a couple of times, but you also need to make sure that the case you're testing right now is the same sort of case, that circumstances haven't changed. Like if every single time in your life you've dropped a marker, it's fallen to the ground, but now you're on the International Space Station and there's no more gravity because you're in orbit, in that case, the circumstances have changed so much that you've never had a case on the International Space Station. So your past experience on Earth is not a good thing to use in this case. So cogency has a matter of both number of cases and how similar the current case is to the past. So if you're somebody who some people just thought, like in this particular case, grandma's behaviors in the past are not a good indication of what she'll sing like in the future, therefore it's not cogent. I was willing to basically, with cogency, as long as you gave me good reasoning, I was willing to give you credit regardless of whether you said yes or no. All right, on to share screen. Share. All right, the second one was I'm just going to say this one because it's very much the same as the last one. It's another inductive that I was thinking that it was cogent, because 8 million, whatever number that is, that has the 89 million with the comma in the wrong place is a lot of times. Key point. Some people said this was deductive because it's natural to think that if it's happened that you've gotten sick 89 million times, that you have a cheese addiction or cheese allergy or something to that effect. However, as this argument is laid out, it's still relying on past experience. You have to remember to keep separate what is actually written as the argument and what you're tempted to conclude because of it. If you've eaten cheese 89 million times, first off, that means that you've been alive for like 100,000 years, but that's a different matter. But if you had eaten it and you got a stomach ache every time, you probably do have a cheese allergy. However, that's not something that we're talking about here. In this case, you're just using the past experience to justify the future case. So it doesn't meet the criteria for deductive. It is an inductive argument. All right, number 3. What was this one? Was it deductive or inductive?
Deductive.
It was deductive because, again, this one is not based on past experience. This is 3 just statements. Was it valid, however?
No.
It is not. This was what I called affirming the consequent. You can imagine, how do we know it's not valid? What would we have to do? Test of what we just talked about 2 minutes ago.
We could add another premise, like stating, like, for example, that dolphins also have teeth.
Yeah. So all you have to do is think of one counterexample of something that has teeth. That isn't a dog. So for instance, as a matter of fact, this is not a true argument because you have teeth and you aren't a dog. Or another thing you could do to show this is you could just add in a premise. Like, you can imagine somebody who would add in another premise that, like, if something's a dog, it has teeth, but dolphins also have teeth. So basically, you could say, long story short, you can imagine a case, a counterexample in which something both has teeth and is not a dog. And that matters because if something is a dog, then it has teeth, assume that's true, and assume that you have teeth, you can still imagine a world in which you aren't a dog. Namely, you're a dolphin, or you're yourself, or anything like that. 4 is the flip side of this one. If something is a dog and it has teeth, Fluffy is a dog, therefore Fluffy has teeth. Is this deductive or inductive?
Deductive.
Yep, and is it valid?
Yes.
Yes, this one was valid. It was valid because we've said by definition, we're assuming that every dog has teeth. The fact that there are, in fact, some dogs who don't have teeth is irrelevant because we're assuming that all dogs do. And once we assume that if something's a dog, then it must have teeth, the very fact that Fluffy's a dog means that we know Fluffy has teeth. 5, what was this one?
It wasn't an argument because it's just a statement of.
Correct. This is just, well, anyone know what this is from?
It's from Lincoln's address.
Yeah, Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln. This is the first lines. This is not an argument. It's just somebody stating facts about the United States in the year 1863. All right, number 6. Was this deductive or inductive?
Deductive.
Deductive, correct. And was it valid?
Yes.
Yes, it was. This was disjunctive syllogism, and it is valid. Yep. All right. 7, inductive or deductive. This was the I've met at least 1,000 people, yada, yada, yada.
Is it inductive?
Inductive.
It is inductive, and again, it's because we're going off of however many you're using the past to make conclusions or draw conclusions about the future. This one, I gave full credit for either cogent or not cogent because I don't know whether 1,000 people taking photos with bomb lighting is a lot of people or not. That's not a really accurate thing. So it could be a lot, could be not a lot. It's up to you. 8, only one person called me out on not being able to spell. So it should be if I eat cheese. Just about everyone just read it as eat cheese instead of each cheese. So I gave, technically speaking, I should have given credit either for not valid or not an argument or valid deductive, depending on whether you gave me credit for writing cheese, even though I didn't write cheese. If the word were each, it would be if the word were eat, it would be a deductive argument and it would be valid. And this is a case of hypothetical syllogism. 9, what was this one? Inductive or deductive?
Inductive. Sorry, inductive.
Inductive. This one was inductive. And again, cogent. If you said that's a lot of duels, therefore it's cogent, I gave you credit. If you said, you never know what's going to happen in a duel, therefore it's not cogent, I also gave you credit. Basically, cogent is hard to judge, and I was feeling good. Number 10, there were 2 correct answers. What were the 2 correct? Any takers on one of the correct answers?
8.
One of the correct answers was deductive. This is Jay-Z lyrics, in which if you read it as an argument, he is giving a disjunctive syllogism for why, if you get pulled over by the cops, you should pull over instead of drive away at high speeds. The other one I was willing to give credit for not an argument, because he's just describing a past event. So if you read it in that way. The one I did not take was inductive, because he's not using past experience to justify his conclusion. He's not saying something like, every other time I've been pulled over, every other time a cop has pulled behind me, I've pulled over, therefore I should do it again. So either deductive, valid deductive, or not an argument. I gave full credit for either of those answers. All right. And again, I will be sending these back to you all either later tonight or more likely tomorrow morning. But on the whole, people did pretty well. If you didn't do great on them, that's okay. You've got a lot more of the semester to go, so do not stress. There's a lot of homeworks. There's a lot of everything else. All right. Everyone good with all that stuff? We good? Homework? Any last questions, comments, concerns, feelings? All right. So. So what do I mean by a complex? Wait, did anybody have any questions? I turned around and then didn't actually see if anyone had any hands up or anything. All right, awesome. So complex arguments. What do we mean by a complex argument? Well, it's not a simple one. That's basically what it means. And so what that means is there's going to be a lot of parts to it. So instead of just having like 2 premises and a conclusion, it'll have multiple steps, where instead of just saying like this proves this, end of story, it'll be this proves this plus this other thing proves this third thing, and that is evidence for this final thing. So for instance, just to come up with an example of what a complex argument might look like, either you're a frog or a prince, you aren't a frog if you're a prince, you have a castle, therefore you have a castle. This would be a complex argument. And it will be a complex argument because it's not just one of the things we talked about last time. It's rather combining a few different arguments together. And the way you can think about this is in terms of drawings or in terms of structures. So the way to think about it is that instead of just thinking of it as a bunch of premises, like the way we've been talking about it is as if it's premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. Instead of thinking like that, Well, you think of it as premise 1, premise 2 leads into 3, and 3 combined with 4 leads to conclusion. So this is what I mean by a complex argument, where it's not just a list, it's rather a structure. So why do I say this one is structured? Well, let me draw up this argument. The way it works is, first off, we have a premise here. What's our first premise? We first have to look up here and, well, let's begin. Like we did a few weeks ago, if this is an argument, step number 1 is to identify what is the conclusion. So what is the thing being proved by this argument? The ultimate conclusion, the thing you're trying to show is true.
You have a castle?
That you have a castle?
Yeah, that you have a castle. It's what comes after the therefore. So we know the conclusion is let's label it. We'll just label this C. Or I'll do it in green so it stands out more. C. We're trying to prove that you have a castle. Now, how many sentences does this leave? Well, it looks like, get out of here. Nah, sorry, there was a bug. So, how many sentences does this leave? Well, it leaves this one. Either you're a frog or a prince. So this is 1. Let me do it in green. Actually, I forgot to include a sentence. I kind of left it implied. So, you're a prince. All right, so there's 1. Here's 2, you aren't a frog. 3, so you're a prince. 4, if you're a prince, you have a castle. So we now have 4 other sentences. So let's think about it this way. Think about sentence 1, 2, and 3. How do these relate to each other? We've got either you're a frog or a prince. You aren't a frog, so you're a prince. Ignoring sentence 4 and the conclusion, what does that look like? Just 1, 2, and 3. What of the things we talked about last week does it look like? Just to put them up here again, we have 1, either frog or prince. 2, not frog. 3, yes, prince. So what does this look like? Which of our things we talked about last week? Any takers?
Is that the modus ponens?
So it's not quite modus ponens, but it's one of the other ones related. It was the one with the or in it.
Disjunctive syllogism?
Yes, disjunctive syllogism. So this is disjunctive syllogism, which means that if we just concentrate on these 3 sentences, what we have here is something that looks like this. 1 is a premise, 2 is a premise, and 3 is a partial conclusion. So if we were drawing it, we could draw it like this. 1 and 2 together prove 3. Now, we ultimately want to prove C. So what if we just concentrate on 3, 4, and C, what is it? We have, if you're a prince, you have a castle. You're a prince, therefore you have a castle. What is this one? I'll give you a clue. I can't remember who, but somebody said it about 35 seconds ago.
Modus ponens?
Yeah, this is modus ponens. This is 3 combined with 4 give you C. So that's what we mean by a complex argument. It steps along the way to proving something more. Now, as a matter of fact, I'm not going to be as concerned from here on out about it being logically valid complex arguments. Instead, we are now going to shift into the more general critical thinking way of the class, and we're going to be talking less about premises and more about reasons. And what do I mean by that? Well, when you're reasoning in your everyday life, we're often doing things having to do with inductive reasoning or things that are not 100% guaranteed, but seem like pretty good guesses. So for instance, if you own a dog, you're a dog person. So here would be a case in which I say, you own a dog, therefore therefore you like dogs. Now, as a matter of fact, is this valid? Is owning a dog a guarantee that you like dogs? No. Somebody may have given you the dog and you fucking hate dogs, but you have a dog anyway. But as a matter of fact, this is usually a pretty good reason to think that somebody likes dogs. And oftentimes, when you're actually reading articles and things, it's going to be these inductive sort of things. And the reason this is a good reason is because inductively this makes sense. Most of the people you've met who own dogs like dogs. There's few in comparison dog owners who don't like dogs. People don't buy things they don't like most of the time. Or at the very least, they don't buy things they know they don't like. So for when we're talking this week about reasons, don't be as worried about deductive sorts of premises and conclusions. Think of these more as inductive premises. That's just something to highlight because for the rest of the semester and most critical thinking and most of what you do in your life, science included, is based on inductive reasoning. Deductive principles will come up and they're very useful to know, but in the arguments with this complex structure, we're going to more often be talking about reasons instead of premises. And I just wanted to highlight that so that when I'm talking about reasons for the rest of class, it makes sense. And the reason I'm using reasons is because we're not going to be talking about these airtight, valid deductive arguments as much. We're instead going to be talking about more inductive arguments where there's no proof. It's much more just your reason for believing this or your evidence for believing this. All right, let me erase this one. So that was our first, just an example of what a complex argument would be. Now, what I want to talk about now is the fact that with complex arguments, the way to think of it is you cannot think about the whole argument as having a certain like general structure. You instead have to think about how things relate to each other. So in the same way that like if you're imagining a line of people and how they're standing next to each other, it's not just saying something like, you have to say how each person relates to the next one. So it'd be like George is next to Mary, and Mary is next to Steve, and Steve is next to Muhammad, and Muhammad is et cetera, et cetera. So in this sort of case, when we're talking about these premises and complex arguments, you have to say something like, how is this thing here related to this thing here? So you've got 1 and 2, and don't think about what's the conclusion and what's the premise. Think instead about which one is, how are these two relating? And with that in mind, there are 3 different types of relationships that a series of premises can have to each other. So, or a series of claims can have to each other, or truths can have to each other. And let me just draw these up, and then I'll explain what they mean, and then I'll give a bunch of examples to help clarify them. 1, convergent. 1, 2, 3. Serial. 1, 2, 3. Linked. 1, 2, 3. So imagine that these are sentences. Using our language from last week, if we were dealing with a simple argument, it would be a conclusion and 2 premises. Or using our term this week, a conclusion and 2 reasons. These are going to be the evidence for the conclusion. And what you find is that these reasons can relate to the conclusion in different ways. Sometimes what you have is a case in which your reasons to believe something else are providing 2 pieces of independent reasons or 2 pieces of independent evidence for a conclusion. So an example of this would be a case like this. Dogs are better than cats. They are friendlier. They don't scratch the furniture. So this is an argument that somebody might give for why dogs are better than cats. And in this particular 3-sentence thing, we'd say that this first thing is the conclusion with respect to these other two. And then what we find is we have 2 independent reasons for thinking that dogs are better. 1, dogs are friendlier, and 2, the dogs don't scratch the furniture. Now, what do I mean by independent here? Why do I say that these are independent reasons? Well, it's because each of them by themselves provides evidence that the conclusion is true. So even if you denied to me and proved to me that dogs don't scratch the furniture because you're like, my dog chews the furniture all the time, that's a terrible argument. This is still a good reason to think that dogs are better. So these are 2 separate reasons to accept the conclusion that provide independent evidence and support the conclusion independently of each other. They converge on it, but they do not depend on each other in any way. Does that make sense to people? And
So
the
how is
reason
this
why,
a complex argument though?
pardon?
How would this be a complex argument?
So thank you, Nicole. So this is the way I should have made this clear. This is a simple argument, but I'm bringing this up because each of these are the types of parts that you could have in a complex argument. So what you could have is this by itself would be a simple argument, but what could happen is that in a more complex argument, it could be the case that you had something like this. So what you could have is in this complex argument, you could have convergent premises upon this premise 3. And this premise, along with 2 and 6, could converge on that one. So what I'm doing here is starting out with the simplest version, basically learn how the little parts work, and then we'll worry about how they can connect together. And the thing about convergent is you can have as many as you need. So for instance, say you want to argue that pizza is the best food in the world. What are some reasons you might give that pizza is the best food in the world? I don't know, it tastes good, it's easy to eat, it's cheap. Each of these, with convergent, you can have any number of convergent premises. So in theory, like this would be a complex argument structure with 5 premises arguing for one conclusion, but all of them are convergent. So convergent is just independent reasons to accept one thing. In the simplest case, it's 2 things working towards one other thing, but it can go up to as many as possible. And this is the first building block that can exist in a complex argument. So the second type of building block which can exist in a complex argument is what is called a serial ordering of premises. So in this case, you can think of it as 1 is still the conclusion, but this here, so it's 2 is your reason for the conclusion, and 3 is your reason to think 2 is true. So an example of this would be New York is better than Boston. New York is more diverse than Boston. Boston is 53% Caucasian. New York is 42% Caucasian. So think about these 3 reasons, or these 3 sentences. Which of these is the conclusion? Which of these is the thing someone is trying to get another person to believe at the end of the day?
The first
New
one.
York.
New York is better than Boston.
Yep, number 1. New York is better than Boston. Now, ask yourself, What is their reason to think that New York is better than Boston? What is their evidence for this?
More diversity.
Yeah, they're trying to point to diversity as a reason to think New York is better. That diversity is a good thing and New York has more of it. Now then, what is this third sentence doing? What is this? Boston is 53% Caucasian while New York is 42% Caucasian. What is that doing? What is the
Evidence.
of that sentence? Yeah, and
It's proving that Boston isn't as diverse as New York.
exactly. It is a reason to accept this other reason, which is your reason for accepting New York is better. This is what's called a serial premise. And it's serial in the sense not of like Captain Crunch, but serial in the sense of one thing after another. So it's this one is evidence for this, and this one is evidence for that. So, yes, Boston is definitely a less diverse city than New York. Whether that means it's better or not, I don't really want to get into fights. I personally like New York better, but if you want to defend Boston, feel free. I'm not going to say you're a terrible person. I will say I grew up a Boston Red Sox fan entirely because I was like 4 and thought it would be funny because my dad was a huge Yankees fan. So for most of my childhood, I rooted for the Red Sox just to laugh at my dad. Don't worry, I don't actually have a baseball team anymore. But yeah, I was a dick of a child, as so many of them are. All right, so that's what we mean by serial. And this is going back to Nicole's point of this by itself, again, is a simple argument in some sense. But we could combine these together. So you could have an argument that looked something like this. And in this case, you'd have this, if you just concentrate on this, it's serial. But this, it's two serial lists converging on a overall conclusion. And what this will look like in practice with examples, we'll get to in a second, but I just wanted to highlight, that's why I'm saying these are complex arguments. Because like Legos, you can combine the different pieces together. Or like computer programs, you can take one program, insert it in another program. All right, the final one are linked premises. And these are the sorts of things we've been dealing with in class thus far. Things like modus ponens, things like disjunctive syllogism, things like hypothetical syllogism. What does it mean for a premise to be linked or two premises to be linked? What this means is by themselves, they do not make a reason to believe some other thing. But if you put them together, they give you a reason to believe some other thing. So just a classic case of this is, by itself, here's the conclusion I want you to draw. Cats are cute. If you've got big eyes, you're cute. Cats have big eyes. By itself, what would the conclusion that you're trying to draw, what would one be? Well, it's the first sentence, cats are cute. By itself, the fact that if you've got big eyes, then you're cute, in no way proves that cats are cute. By itself, doesn't do anything. The fact that cats have big eyes by itself doesn't prove anything. But you combine these two together, you combine the fact that if you've got big eyes, you're cute, and cats have big eyes, those together prove the conclusion. That's a linked premise. So serial is three things where one proves that one thing serves as the conclusion. This one is a reason for the conclusion, and the third thing is a reason for the second thing. A convergent premises are ones in which you have two independent reasons to believe something. And then linked is a case in which you have two reasons, but they only are two premises, two reasons that only together prove some other thing. They only work if you have them both at the same time. And I'm putting all of this up here because we're now, for the rest of class, just going to do a couple examples of an actual example of a complex argument. in which we talk about how to come up with a structured diagram to capture how all the different parts fit together. So the first one I want to do is put up a here's a bunch of sentences. Dinosaurs are awesome. If you are if something is big and an animal, it's awesome. If something is big and an animal, it's awesome. Dinosaurs were big animals. Also, dinosaurs looked so damn cool. So that's going to be our argument. What if you came across these? The first thing to do is we have to label all the possible reasons or all the different sentences here. So how many do we have? 1, dinosaurs are awesome. 2, if something is big and an animal, it's awesome. So that's number 2. 3, dinosaurs were big animals. So big and an animal. 4, also dinosaurs looked so damn cool. So we have 4 possible sentences. If you came across these 4 sentences, so whenever you're forming one of these argument structures, there's always going to be one ultimate conclusion that the person who said this would be trying to get across. So in this case, if somebody said these 4 sentences in this order, what would they be trying to prove? What is their ultimate conclusion?
Dinosaurs are awesome.
Yes, so the final conclusion is conclusion. Dino equals awesome. Now, if that's your final conclusion, that the dinosaur is awesome, we now have 3 other premises. How do these fit together? Well, I'll give you a clue. I will draw up the structure, and then our job as a class is going to be to figure out which sentence goes where, so we can understand what's happening here. So here's what the argument structure of this looks like. So we've got a blank here, a blank here, and a blank here. So just to show my diagram, what does this mean? This here. Which of these? Is this linked, convergent, or serial?
Linked.
That's linked. So what does that mean? Well, it means we're looking for 2 premises that work together to provide a reason for the conclusion. Then, now comparing these 2, what is the relationship between these 2?
Convergent.
So yeah, what we're going to have is a linked set of premises that is one reason, and a separate reason that converges with that and gives an additional reason to think that dinosaurs are awesome. So based on that, which 2 of premises are linked together to prove the conclusion, and then what is an independent reason to think that something is true? So 2 and 3 are linked, Valerie? Yes. So 2, 3, those are linked together because if something is big and an animal, it's awesome. Combined with dinosaurs were big animals leads to the conclusions dinosaurs are awesome. And then what does that leave 4? Well, 4 is a separate reason to think that dinosaurs were awesome. Namely, they looked cool. That would be the structure of this argument. So this is a more complex argument in which instead of just a conclusion with 2 premises, it's a conclusion that is being supported 1 by a set of linked premises and 2 by a separate convergent premise. So everyone understand how that goes. For the homework assignment, I made the mistake last semester of just giving a bunch of sentences and then asking everyone to draw the diagrams. And then I tried doing it myself and failed. And I think the highest grade on it was like a 25. And then I realized that is an unacceptable assignment to give everyone. Therefore, I gave everyone 100 and because that was my failure, and gave the new version. So you get the new version, or inspired by the new version, which is you'll get the arrows. And so you're not going to have to start. Instead, you'll see something like this on the homework. And I'll ask you which of these sentences goes where. So that's just to give you an idea of what I'm looking for on the homework. That's what to expect. It's still, some of them are quite complicated, have complex structures. So it's still going to take some thought, but that's what you can. Woo!
Nice
All right,
cap.
well, things are going great over here. Nothing to see. Everything's fine over here, thank you. All right, next complex argument. The joys of at-home teaching. Thank you. I played Little League. I used to have, I could go into many stories about, I used to have very good hand-eye coordination. It was one of the joys of being an only child. And not having anyone to throw a ball with. You just threw it with yourself a lot. You got very good at hand-eye coordination. All right, so here's another one. Staten Island is the... First off, I apologize to anybody who's about to be offended by this. All right. Staten Island is the worst borough. Staten Island is the hardest to get to. You need to take a boat or own a car. Staten Island is also the toughest to get around. There's just one puny subway line. And Staten Island is home to the nation's biggest garbage dump. Those are sentences. How many are there? Well, we've got Staten Island is the worst borough. 1. Staten Island is the toughest to get to. 2. You need to own a car. 3. Or you need to take a boat. Staten Island is also the toughest to get around. 4. There's just one puny subway line. 5. Nation's biggest garbage dump. 6. So we have 6 sentences here. These form an argument structure. What is going to be at the very top of our argument structure? What is the main conclusion somebody who said this would be trying to prove?
Staten Island is the worst.
Arrow.
Yep. So the very top of the thing would be 1. 1 is at the top. Now, what you do next, so again, on the homework, I will not ask you to do this from scratch like I'm about to do or we're all about to do together. But just reading this over, thinking about it, just pick 2 premises. Look at 2. Is 2 something that is designed to directly support this conclusion? Or is it something that's supporting a different conclusion? Or is it something that's working with something else to support a conclusion?
I think it's working with another premise.
And which one is it working with?
I think it's 2 and 2 and 3.
So 2 and 3 are, what Mike's picking up on is these two are somehow linked. 2 and 3 are somehow linked. Now the question is, what is the relationship between them? Is it that 2 and 3 are combining to prove 1 in the way that modus ponens is? Or is 3 evidence for 2, or is 2 evidence for 3?
I think it's
Serial.
Say that again,
yeah,
Cameron.
serials.
Oh. I didn't actually hear what people said because I was too worried about trying to make sure everyone got a turn to speak, that by the time you both spoke, you were speaking kind of simultaneously, but also not, and I didn't catch either of what you said. So what's the relationship?
Serial.
Yeah, they're serial.
And 3 is proving 2.
Yep, that's exactly right. So what we have here is 2 is a reason to prove 1. So we know that 2 is somehow going to be going up to 1. And we know that 3 is proving 2. So 3 proves 2, 2 proves 1. Now, let's look at number 4. The next question is, how does 4 relate to what we've already got? Is 4 something that's connected to what we've got here? Or is 4 a separate thought? Is 4 in some way linked to 2 or 3? Is 4 just another reason to think that Staten Island sucks?
It's a separate thought.
Yeah, it's a separate reason. So we know that 4 is not going to be on this chain. It's not linked. So 4 is going to be over here somewhere. We don't know whether it's going to directly support here or if it's going to support something else. But we know that it's not over here.
Professor,
Now,
why
once
not though?
Pardon?
So why not? Because I feel like it could tie into 2, where you said that Staten Island is the hardest place to get. I'm sorry, I think 3, when you said you need to take a boat or own a car.
So here's the thing. What I was trying to say is Staten Island is the hardest to get to, and it's also the hardest to get around once you're on it, or get around once on. So what you could say is we could add another premise here that would tie them together. I was trying to think of them as separate, but Antonio, you're spot on that there is kind of in the background this other thing, which is Staten Island's transportation is the worst overall. So what you could imagine is that there's like another sentence here, like number, I guess, 5.5, which would be something like, all this means that Staten Island has the worst transportation of any borough. So if we were treating it as there's also that premise, you would be correct that we could treat 2 and 3 as one set of linked premises, and then we'd have a separate set of premises about the getting around once you're on it that would be also linked to transportation. But as I was laying this out, it would be, there's one topic of getting to Staten Island, then here's a separate one, which is it's the toughest one to get around on. Like, you know, getting around on Staten Island is terrible. And that's a separate thing than getting to Staten Island. Because getting to, like, you know, it can be mildly annoying to get to Manhattan. But once you're there, there's every subway line in the known universe to get around. So that's how I was thinking of them as different. But what, as you point to, sometimes it's hard to, sometimes you'll want to identify, your mind will jump to a conclusion of, oh, these both have to do with transportation. And in the actual homework, I won't have multiple transportation related ones. But you understand, as I was trying to explain, or as I laid it out just there, why these are being thought of as separate. Because one's about transportation to, and the other's to transportation on. And 3 is a reason to think that it's hard to get to. And well, 4 is once you're getting around on it, the boat isn't important because you're already on the island. That make a little sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay, just making sure. All right, so I've kind of given away, how do 4 and 5 relate to each other?
Serial.
Did you say serial again, Cameron? Yep, they are another set of serial. So 4 and 5, and again, which one is proving which, and then which one is directly proving that Staten Island's the worst?
5 proves 4, and 4 is proving 1. The
Yep.
conclusion.
So 4 proves 1, and 5 proves 4. So that's what we've got here. We've got 5 proves 4, 4 proves 1. And now we see 2 and 4 are two separate convergent premises to prove 1, but each of those has its own serial premise as well. So this is why it's tough to talk in terms of premises and conclusions here, or reasons and conclusions, because this is the ultimate conclusion. However, this is not a premise for that conclusion. It's a premise for like a sub-conclusion or a partial conclusion or a somewhat, so there's not really good language. So it's much easier to think about them just in terms of relations to each other. Now, what is 6? How does 6 fit into this? Just think about it. Yeah, it's another convergent, and a convergent that proves what? Does it prove that Staten Island is the toughest to get around on once you're there? No. Does it prove that Staten Island is the hardest to get to? No. What does it prove? Well, we generally don't like garbage dumps. So we can imagine that this here is going to be 6. It is just another convergent premise on 1. We could even imagine that this was itself something that we could say is a linked premise of, so we could say Staten Island is home to the nation's biggest garbage dump, and if you have the nation's biggest garbage dump, you are the worst. So if this was on here, if you've got the biggest garbage dump, number 7, it would look something like this, where 6 and 7 are linked premises that together act as a convergent reason for 1. So does that make sense? How all of these things work together? So that's what so on the homework, what you'll get is a diagram. And then that diagram, oh wow, I really cut my arm open. Well, this has been like a really great class for me. I knock over the board, I slice my arm open on a wall. Don't mind me. I've never had an actual teaching injury before. I feel like this is a new experience for me. Yeah, this it's just sometimes it's just all you can do is laugh. It's one of those ones that doesn't actually hurt. I didn't even realize it was there. I felt myself scratch, but that was that. All right. The fun of teaching at home. So, any last questions on linked premises, conclusions, anything like that? All right. Rather than bleed everywhere, I'm probably going to end class at this point so that I can go clean myself up. Does anyone have any last questions on it? Again, the homework will look something like this. You would be given, this is what it would look like. You'd have a structure like this, or a paragraph like this, and then you'd be handed something like this. It would say A, B, C, D, E. F, G. And then I'd ask you which, the answer would be something like A equals 1, B equals 2, F equals 3. And so that's how you would answer it, just lining it up like that. All right. If there's no more questions, I am going to dismiss you all and go take care of my bleeding. I've never had that happen.
Professor.
Thank you. I hope all of you have a safer night than I do.
Professor.
All right, have a good one.
Thank you,
Take care,
Professor.
Professor.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Professor.